chick flicks, romantic comedies, rom-coms. You love them, you hate them, but I am here to eviscerate them. Greetings and salutations, I'm Jonelle Walker, and this is the RomCom Killjoys podcast. I'm a writer and researcher who studies gender theory, ideology, and representations of both in popular culture. I've brought together some of my pop culture literate friends to help me destroy your favorite movies and offer an antidote for your poor, aching heart. Let's get started with the slaughter, shall we? All right, everyone. So it is coronavirus season, era, something like that. So we're all stuck at home in our various survival dens, binge watching everything. And this morning, I found myself watching a nice gem of a rom-com called He's Just Not That Into You. And I reached out to my friends afterwards and I thought, I hate this movie. Someone scream at the sky with me about how much I hate this movie. So a podcast was born and we're here to figure out why is it that we watch these films endlessly that make us want to scream at the sky. So our first guest on this journey is going to be Eliza Bertrand. Eliza, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hey there. Hey, Jonelle. Hey, everyone else. I'm Eliza. I studied film in college. I have a major in film and media studies and a minor in cinema studies. And so I can analyze a film very professionally, and yet I still, most of the time, would rather watch like a really shitty rom-com or like a Marvel movie or something. So I don't know what that tells you about me, but there it is.
What that tells us about you is that you're just like the rest of us, as it turns out. Let's start with the movie that started it all for me, 2009's He's Just Not That Into You.
He's not.
So to start, let's read a short summary of this film. Baltimore-based friends and lovers, all in their 20s and 30s, try to navigate their way through the complexities of modern relationships. Beth, played by Jennifer Aniston, wants commitment from Neil, Ben Affleck, who sees nothing wrong with the status quo. Gigi, Jennifer Goodwin, mid-2000s icon, is tired of waiting by the phone, while Mary, Drew Barrymore, has a slew of supportive male friends, none of whom are straight. Oh my. Meanwhile, Janine, actress unspecified, has trust issues with her husband. This is Jennifer Connelly.
That's Jennifer Connelly's character.
Who can't trust himself around Anna, played by the irreplaceable Scarlett Johansson. So ostensibly, that is what this film is about. But Eliza, what is this movie really about?
So this movie is about why all relationships fail and what should happen to make all relationships work. It's based on the self-help book, He's Just Not That Into You. And the idea is here are all of these 20 and 30 somethings, all wonderfully attractive, all with very sort of generic Hollywood professional skills that can't make love work because they're all just doofusy enough that they are not perfect for the opposite sex. And so the movie seems to imply that if you just learn to play the game better, you'll actually be able to get the perfect man or woman and live happily ever after if you just fix yourself.
A very good summary. Although, I think what I'm interested in with this movie in terms of what it's really about is like, what is that game that they're talking about? That's kind of when I stepped away from it, I just couldn't stop thinking about what is this game and why does it seem like this game is only being played by women?
Well, and there seems to be a different game being played by the men, right? Like the men are all playing this game where they're unavailable to the women because it's cool or because they're not ready yet or because they're actually in love with someone else. And the women are all totally unaware of the rules. And then the women and the gay men, who are all wonderful stereotypes of a early 2000s gay man, are all trying to figure out the game the men are playing, which
right.
I just think is so unrealistic because none of us know the rules. I say as someone currently in the dating world.
Well, I'm right there with you, and it's true. I think it doesn't also give due respect to the fact that men also don't know the rules, as you said, right? There's not this one sort of heterosexual fantasy game that they've made up the rules to mitigate the rules on and then succeed at every time. They also have insecurities and confusions and stuff that they're trying to figure out. So it does sort of feel, while it's extremely unfair to women in its very unflattering portrayal of all of their sort of desperation, it's maybe even more, no, I shouldn't say even more. It's even more offensive to the gay men of the film, no question. Yes. But it is also unfair, I think, to the heterosexual men to say that,
absolutely,
like, they're these Neanderthals, in a sense, who don't know what they want, but only know that they want to sort of
fuck Scarlett Johansson.
Fuck Scarlett Johansson.
It's really amazing that the thesis of this movie is that every man wants Scarlett Johansson with badly dyed blonde hair and boobs that are spilling too much out of her summer dress.
Yes, I actually think that maybe it would be productive even for us to start with Scarlett Johansson's character and then go down all of the women in this film and all of the ways in which they are portrayed as failing at this, as we've stated, heterosexual game that men make up the rules for and yet are not playing somehow. Mm-hmm. So we start with Scarlett Johansson. What's her deal?
So she is a young woman who can't make love work, living in the big city. She is at all times wearing very low-cut summer-style dresses, V-neck, deep cut. She has platinum blonde hair and extra pouty lips. It's as if they gave her lips an extra collagen injection just for this movie. And she meets a guy at a grocery store who instantly starts flirting with her, which, as you know, is every woman's favorite way to meet a guy. And he, to his credit, to Bradley Cooper's credit, within about 5-10 minutes of meeting her says, I am a married man, I can't flirt with you. He's been flirting with her up to that point, but he does in fact immediately say, I'm married, I can't flirt with you. For the rest of the movie, she actively pursues this man, continually asks him to help her with her music career, which we never hear anything more about beyond that vague 2-word title, and then immediately seduces him and starts sleeping with him. And at the end of the movie, he still sleeps with his wife in quite a cringeworthy scene, and she's so horrified that she gathers her clothes and storms off, heartbroken.
Yes, before which, having slept with him in his office with gigantic floor-to-ceiling windows, all I could think when I was watching it was like, my God, women, you are in your bra and panties, and people can see you having sex with a married man.
Well, and they pass like 8 people in his office in order to get into his office, and then close the door and lock it. And you've got to think, okay, if you're, secretary or assistant or whatever, and all of your underlings see you take a scantily clad blonde woman into your office, lock the door, be in there for 20 minutes, and then come back out again, like, are they not gonna have an assumption about what you were doing in there?
I guess this is a fantasy world where Bradley Cooper doesn't actually look like Bradley Cooper, and his coworkers are supposed to assume, like, oh no, not that Bradley Cooper.
Meeting.
He never gets laid, not once in his life.
Not and to of course Scarlett Johansson and Jennifer Connelly.
Well, let's move on to her. So Bradley Cooper's character is married to sad brunette, notably brunette, Jennifer Connelly. Dark brunette, who is his long-suffering wife, who was his college girlfriend, who gave him an ultimatum about 32. Marriage. Right, at age 32, long-suffering wife. We learn that she's, I assume, a successful copy editor of some kind. She has a job where she does things with writing, but we never really get into that because, of course, it's not relevant to her character.
No, although 4 of the women in the movie work at this office that does vague copy editing or writing or something.
Right. I think all that we get is that they write copy for Nutmeg, which really raises some questions for me about what copy you're writing for Nutmeg. But maybe that's a meta joke that we're supposed to get but doesn't quite land. Who knows? But so Jennifer Connelly's character, we're supposed to believe, pressured Bradley Cooper into marrying her, gave him an ultimatum.
After they'd been dating for 7 years after college, or some, horrifying number or whatever.
Right, some just absolutely devastating number. They got married at the ripe old age of 27. And now they have not had sex in years, Eliza. She cries
and
about
yet they're
it in the
buying
office.
a house and completely renovating the house. Her biggest role in this movie is that she's constantly at this beautiful 2-story townhouse talking to the contractor and all of the workers to make sure that the house is being fixed up enough. Now, they seem to be remodeling the kitchen, the bathroom, 2 bedrooms, the outside, the backyard, painting everything, and installing floor and tile. that she is constantly in the middle of the day checking up on, but continually finding cigarettes around the unfinished house. And she has told Bradley Cooper that he has to stop smoking, and she's convinced every time she finds cigarettes that they're his and he's lying to her, which, because this is a predictable rom-com, they are, and he is.
And of course, the cigarettes are a cipher for his infidelities and all of the lying we're supposed to presume that he does. So her failure, where we have Scarlett Johansson's failure in the eyes of this film, is that she's, well, actually, come to think of it, we should come back to this. Scarlett Johansson doesn't fail at all, but we'll come back to this.
The movie's quite sympathetic to her.
Very
the movie
sympathetic.
sort of makes it seem, and there are many scenes in which she's crying to friends on the phone, including to the boy who she ends up sleeping with in order to get over Bradley Cooper. It makes it seem as though she is the one who has been jilted and left by this man who lied to her, even though she actively pursues him from the beginning. But she's
Absolutely.
blonde and young and is allowed to do those things, whereas Jennifer Connelly is old and brunette and spends all of her time talking to the contractors, and so her insistence that her husband is honest with her about whether or not he's smoking is seen as a major fault.
Yeah, she's been cast, her failure, she's been cast as this sort of nagging wife who has like lost her sense of fun and is too serious and is way too invested in the domestic, which is of course connected to her obsession with the house. And yeah, there is that really stark scene where he's, mounting Scarlett Johansson on the desk of his office, and Jennifer Connelly shows up to check in on him, and lo and behold, Scarlett Johansson hides in the closet, and in comes sad brunette Jennifer Connelly in her beautiful bustier to seduce Bradley Cooper, working very hard, by the way, to not be sexy while she does it. Like, it was...
Yes, kudos to Jennifer Connelly for somehow making herself, while in that bustier, still seem sad and pathetic.
I think she, at one point faltered just a little bit, and they make such a big deal out of it, where she's like, oh my, I'm so sorry. Like, I just vaguely tripped a little bit, and you just got to see a little bit more of my beautiful form. And then, of course, we have Jennifer Connelly's work mates, as you suggested. She has
work proximity acquaintances.
Mm-hmm.
She's got two of them, yes.
Start with? Yes, she has the two work acquaintances. So we have Jennifer Goodwin's character. How about we go to her next? She's quite a central character.
She's the meat of the story. For an ensemble cast, if there is a main character, I would argue it is Jennifer Goodwin, who may very well be the youngest member of this ensemble cast. She's quite young in this movie.
That does seem to be the suggestion. And she is kind of, if Justin Long, who ends up being her romantic interest, is also kind of the stand-in for the author of the book upon which the film is based, he's just not that into you. He sort of serves as this wise bartender who teaches her that the truth is that if men are into you, they'll pursue you.
Yes, he is the all-knowing man who, because the movie claims because he works at a bar and watches people do this awkward mating dance all night, every night, has come to understand all of the rules and all of the ways around it. So when Jennifer Goodwin's character becomes infatuated with a friend of Justin Long's who has no interest in her, he becomes her wise Yoda and tells her, he didn't call you back, that means he doesn't love you. That guy gave you a sort of awkward end of the night greeting, that means he's not going to call you. And Jennifer Goodwin becomes obsessed with asking this guy's advice.
Yes, even though what's interesting is that as we get deeper into their relationship, his sort of expertise on what it means to pursue a relationship comes into question, and there is a sort of interesting moment where Jennifer Goodwin stands up to him and makes this big speech about how I'm closer to finding someone because I'm willing to give it a shot and you're not. But what's intriguing about that to me is that ultimately, even though those are the words coming out of her mouth, the structure of the story tells us that in the end, he was still right. Justin Long's character was still right because the reason he ended up becoming attracted to her was that she stopped showing an interest in him.
Yes. Yeah, once she plays hard to get, suddenly he becomes the infatuated puppy who's calling her and hanging up, who's, whatever, driving by her apartment, doing all the things that if you're into someone are cute and if you're not are incredibly creepy. And it's only when she suddenly becomes an unavailable object to him.
Exactly. And I think in that way, they're sort of, maybe we could suggest that they're a younger version of the fourth and final couple in the pairing, which I know is a favorite of yours, Jennifer Aniston and Ben Affleck.
I do think that they have, one, the most hopeful storyline, the one that actually makes you feel positively about the world of dating, but also, in the end, what I think is the most realistic, because it's one of the only ones that deals with the real-world implications of a romantic relationship and a life partner. in a way that the other situations just never really touch on.
Right, we kind of see the life cycle of their relationship in a way that feels like it's saying something. I agree, where they're the only ones who we sort of see come to fruition. They get married in the end on a boat, of all places. Mm-hmm. Isn't that right?
Yes, a very romantic. There's 3 whole people at their weddings. So even though it's already been established that she has a family of like 20 people. But yeah, there's this whole thing. He wants to be with her forever, but he doesn't believe in marriage because men don't believe in marriage, only when women trick them into it. And she has been with him for a long time and wants to get married. All of her sisters are getting married, and she feels very put out that they're still, haven't made this final step. But as the story goes on, you see that he is the most supportive of all of the male partners in this. She compares him to her sister's husbands, to her friends' husbands and boyfriends, and he's there for her when her father is sick. He's hanging up pictures in their apartment that she casually mentioned she needed to get around to hanging up. Things like that, yes, are all individual stand-ins for their greater relationship, but do show that he is willing and able to participate actively in their relationship, which is what ultimately makes her say, it's okay if we do or don't get married because you're a better husband to me than anyone else I see.
Absolutely. And there's something really intriguing about how he comes to represent what it should ideally mean for a man to be, quote unquote, into you. Mm-hmm. In a way that the other men in the film don't necessarily represent, although they're all sort of put forward to us as being, quote unquote, into their ultimate romantic partners. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of interesting that the film has a hard time, I think, making sense of its own internal logic about what that is supposed to mean. So,
yes,
for example, we have this sort of throwaway character who I don't even think we could consider part of the central cast, but Drew Barrymore's character has all of these sort of failed...
She is sort of the Tinder or the Hinge person of this storyline, although it happened 11 years ago now, and so not many of those dating apps existed yet. But the things you hear her say are much closer to the sort of conversations I think I have with my friends now. We talked a bunch of times, but then he never asked me out, and then I never asked him out, and then I did, but then I never heard back from him. It's much more that sort of thing before even getting to the potential relationship stage.
And it's fascinating because perhaps if they had made the movie a few years later, they would have had better fodder for this. But ultimately, yes, she sort of ends up with a character who we've had really no significant build of their relationship. And yet somehow at the end, we're supposed to say, oh, he's the guy who's really into her. But we have no reason to believe that.
No, they're trying for the Sleepless in Seattle style thing where both characters so well that once they meet and have instant chemistry, you think, oh, these are the ones who are right for each other, except that they're both very minor characters in the story. They're both sort of 3rd or 4th on the list for their gender category, and so we don't actually know that much about them other than that the movie is telling us we should ship them.
Yes.
Which feels very hollow in comparison to some of these other stories, which for an ensemble cast are much more fleshed out.
Yeah, you sort of wonder why they felt the need to have such a wide net in these stories, and that makes me think about what the film is ultimately trying to tell us. Because, I mean, as the birth of this podcast, this is a really clear example of a film trying to put forward a theory, right? A theory about what dating actually is. So it's intriguing to me that they decided to pick all of these different examples, a kind of wide variety, like a sampler pack, if you will, of instances of dating. But, I think of the 5 or so couples that we follow, 1 being minor and 4 being major, how many of those people end up alone? At least 2 of those pairings.
Right, and there's also, it's clearly trying, as you say, to show this variety pack of relationships, and yet the actual variety you're looking at is not varied at all. The youngest character is maybe 25 or 26. The oldest character is maybe 35, most likely younger than that. They're all white. They're all exact same socioeconomic bracket, not particularly wealthy. I mean, it's a movie, so they have big apartments, but their jobs are sort of middle of the road, successful, but not extreme. They all are in the same 2 social groups. Somehow there's several characters who never interact and yet are still all friends with the same people in a way that feels like overkill. And at most you have some people who are dating, some people who have been dating for a long time and haven't gotten married yet, and then 1 married couple who end up not together by the end of the movie. It's not varied enough that you actually see people who are coming from different backgrounds or looking for different things. Everyone in this movie is looking to end up with the right person, get married, and live happily ever after.
Yeah, I think that's the ultimate irony of this film for me, especially as something that's trying to put forward this idea of I'm telling it how it is, right? That he's just not that into you. That's a sentiment that says, like, I have this very ingrained truth that I'm offering up, and yet we have, as you say, a very unrealistic cast that's reflected by the fact that the film is set in Baltimore, and the only black character is a woman in a cutaway scene with Justin Long, who is for some reason totally fine with him picking up a call from another woman while they are making out. And then the only man of color in the film is a guy named Javier, who's working on Jennifer Connelly's house, who she berates metaphorically about the cigarettes that her husband is smoking in their house that are actually representative of the affair that he's having. And he didn't deserve that. That wasn't right. So
and
it's
I do
sort
believe
of funny.
There are two other men of color, two of the three-person gay man posse. We have a darker-skinned Hispanic man and an Asian man who are played as the, you know, very stereotypical versions of that gay man. And exist in two scenes just to butter up Drew Barrymore.
Indeed. The sort of dynamic that goes on between Drew Barrymore and these gay men around her who are her cheerleaders, it seems, but they're also positioned to be the people giving her the sort of real talk, again, sort of wise male advice that Justin Long's character is offering, which feels both very inauthentic to how dating conversations, I think, often take place between gay men and straight women, but also just does not, I should say that it gives us a window into the fact that even though this film is trying to put forward this like universal truth about how dating is supposed to work, it obviously doesn't work for everyone because it doesn't consider, you know, queerness at all. And the film is putting forward this question of maybe it doesn't even consider anything that's not white.
And to me, this film almost seems like instead of actually being a statement on the different types of relationships and types of people who are in relationships out there, it seems to be a statement about the different types of people who exist in 2000 rom-coms. You know, it seems to be like, okay, well, you know, the period from 1999 to 2009 was a very particular time for rom-coms, and everyone was very stereotyped and fell into very specific tropes, and we're going to put all of those tropes into one movie.
And you kind of, I was actually, when you bring that up, I really think about how there's a sense of possibility in this film for that meta quality that they could be making here. Like in some ways, you know, you think about, I don't know, like Love Actually, for example, being a film that's more or less aware of what it is, but it doesn't feel like this film knows necessarily that it's playing in stereotype, even though it obviously is. In that way, I think it's actually quite similar to the Sex and the City episode that it sort of sprang from, where you're dealing with characters who sort of like live on the border between reality and fantasy, but there's not a lot of good work being done in terms of the theory of reality that's being offered to help us differentiate between like, okay, well, so are you telling me that this is what life is like? Or are you trying to tell me that this is what life could be like if it was a lot more fun and a lot more campy?
Like, it doesn't really, there are moments that you think, okay, I know that person or I've had that conversation, but for the most part, these do not feel like authentic relationships. And the advice that the movie gives does not feel authentic. Now, full disclosure, I have not read the book, He's Just Not That Into You. I do remember the period of time where it came out and became quite popular among a certain subset, but it also almost immediately, if I'm remembering correctly, became a punchline, became a joke that people were saying, oh, you need to give this book to your saddest female friend to make her get over her ex-boyfriend, rather than it actually being a helpful guide to how to think about relationships in a way that is healthier for yourself. And this movie leans in much more, I think, to the joke of the book than maybe what the book is actually intending, whether it succeeds in that or not. Because the movie is saying, yes, here are all these stereotypes of nonchalant men who don't care about their women and over-obsessed, pathetic women who put too much into their relationships, rather than trying to create anything real.
I really hope that that's true. I mentioned to you this morning that when I was Googling around about this movie, when I was starting to get really angry about it, the first thing that came up was a Vice article about how this book, if you quote unquote ignore the gendered language, transfers beautifully to 2020 as like a guide, like a field guide for modern dating. And what I worry about that is, as you say, I think there is a sort of sense that in an earlier time, it was almost a joke. Um, and it was very much a joke at women's expense to say that women are always sort of throwing themselves at men and men are inherently not receptive to that sort of approach. But now there's this sense that as we're sort of thinking less and less within the gender binary, that, oh, but no one likes to have people throw themselves at them. Nobody likes to be pursued so much.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that I'm curious to see what the afterlife of this book is going to be in the Tinder age, if it still is. So
Sure.
maybe people can let us know whether or not they ever have these thoughts of he's just not that into you, girl. If he was, he would message you back on Tinder.
Right. And have you said this to your friends? Because the implication of the title of the book, which is then carried over into, for the most part, the gay characters in this movie, is that it's a friend saying to you, he's just not that into you. That's why he didn't call you back. That's why he didn't text you back. And I think we've all certainly said to our friends, he doesn't seem like he's worth it. She doesn't seem like she's worth it. You know, maybe they're not calling you back for a reason, or maybe they said that terrible thing to you and they didn't actually mean it when they apologized. But I do think that in a relationship, there's a balancing act of how to realize when you're not receiving the same thing back from your partner that you're giving, but also figuring out when you do need to put more into it in order to make the relationship work, because it may be you who's not communicating even though you think you are. And so restricting that to the simple phrase of he's just not that into you is already a very narrow-minded and very specific viewpoint to be beginning from.
You're right. I think, that's a good place to wrap up our conversation, is to say that if there is anything to be salvaged from this trash fire movie, which I encourage all of you to go on Netflix and give a thumbs down to, is that exactly that, right? That there is this sense that underneath all of this sort of gendered approach to telling women that they're too desperate is this genuinely good advice that is, listen, be receptive to the feedback that you're getting back from the people that you're engaging with, whether that's your established partner for years and years and years or it's someone you just met. I think that there is a kernel of real genuine truth to that. I hear that, Eliza.
Sure. And in this movie, I think the good thing you can take away is do talk to your friends about it. You know, they may not all be quite the overly stereotyped tropes that they are in this movie, but there are a lot of scenes in this movie of the various women talking to their friends about the relationships they're going into, which I personally always love to see in a romantic comedy, because if you just see the couple interacting and none of the rest of their life, it's never going to feel real.
Well, I think now is a good time to pivot to our final sort of stopping place for this episode, which is talking about antidotes. We kind of want to end every episode with as negative as we can get about these movies. As we've been saying, there's always a kernel of something to be gleaned from them. There's always a kind of kernel of truth or a kernel of good advice. And we want to offer you, dear listeners, a piece of pop culture that can provide an antidote to the ills of this movie. Eliza, what's your antidote for he's just not that into you?
So I'm going to start with another rom-com that I think if you're looking for an ensemble cast that shows a variety of different relationships, we mentioned it briefly earlier, and that's Love Actually. Because I think if that's what you're looking for, Love Actually did it first, and Love Actually did it best. And there are things wrong with Love Actually, Lord knows. Every Christmas, the articles come out complaining about the sweaters, complaining about the strange relationships. But it does show people in their 40s and 50s, people in their 70s, young people, people who are in love, people who are in friendships, and I think it just is a better, all-encompassing story to demonstrate what different people are going through than this one is.
Mine is going to go in a slightly different direction. because we are in this time of coronavirus, I thought it would be appropriate to recommend my favorite book of all time, which is Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And while that is a bit of a tongue-in-cheek joke about coronavirus, really and truly, I recommend it because if you wanted to give this book another sort of subtitle, it would be She is Just Not That Into You.
Absolutely.
Because the plot of the book, for those who are not aware, is that the beautiful, lovely young man, Florentino Ariza, falls in love with the cold and haughty, brilliant and beautiful Fermina Daza. He doesn't get her, but he pursues her for 65 years. Even though she marries somebody else, she tells him over and over she's not interested. But when her husband dies, he comes for her. And it is a beautiful story, and knowing all of those plot details doesn't spoil it at all, because it is just a magical, magical book about pursuing your love even when it doesn't make sense. And I'm okay with that.
Absolutely. To throw a few more out there, when we were discussing this movie with our friends earlier today, one of our friends suggested as an antidote to this the book Persuasion by Jane Austen, as well as the 1995 filmed version of it. And I think, honestly, any Jane Austen would be a great antidote to this movie, because all of them include someone who first falls for the wrong person and ultimately learns what they should actually be looking for in love and ends up with the right person in the end. So if that's the storyline you're looking for, it's hard to go wrong with Austen.
I think that's perfect. I think if we had to sum it up, Eliza, to close us out, what would you say is the moral of this conversation? What's our romantic moral of the story here?
This movie claims that he's just not that into you until the moment he is. And I think in reality, it's just more complicated than that.
I would agree. I think that maybe that is the thing that raises my hackles about this film, is that love and romance is so particular to every pairing that it's always important to keep complexity in mind, because sometimes it might seem like he's not into you, but he is. Or it might seem like she is into you, but she's not. It's hard to really put a blanket statement on love. I think that's my moral.
Well, Jonelle, it was great talking to you about this. This was an excellent way to spend quarantine day number 1.
Yes, thanks, Eliza, for joining me digitally in my living room to discuss this film that I hate. Thank you so much.
Baby love, my baby love, I need you, oh how I need you.
Thanks for listening to the RomCom Killjoy podcast. I'm your host, Jonelle Walker. Our theme song is Lady Slut Hitchhike Love by the band A Giant Dog. And the song you're listening to now is a cover of one of my favorites, Baby Love, by Colin Langanis. Thanks so much, and don't forget, Killjoys, never let anyone kill your joy. See you next time.
Let's start some kissing and making up. Don't throw our love away. In my arms, why don't you stay?